The chilling silence had been Evelyn Reed's most constant companion for nearly 4 decades. It had settled over her like the Oregon coastal fog, dampening the vibrant colors of memory, yet never quite extinguishing the faint glow of hope. At 72, her life in the quiet town of Crescent Cove was a tapestry woven from routine. The scent of brewing coffee each morning, the familiar creak of the old floorboards, the rhythmic crash of waves against the distant shore. Every Tuesday, she walked the familiar path to the small community library, her sensible shoes whispering on the pavement, seeking solace in the pages of well-worn novels that offered temporary escape from the gnawing ache of the past. It was in these quiet moments, perched on her favorite armchair by the window, the afternoon light filtering through the dust motes dancing in the air, that Evelyn allowed herself to revisit the ghost of 1985. That was the year her son, Liam, the incandescent lead guitarist of the Obsidian Echoes, vanished into thin air, along with his bandmates, on a private jet flight over the vast Pacific. The official report had been terse, inconclusive, presumed crash, no wreckage, no survivors. A mystery that had gnawed at her soul, leaving an open wound that never truly healed. Her peace, fragile and hard-won, shattered with the insistent ring of the landline in the kitchen. Evelyn, startled, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the receiver, half expecting a telemarketer or a neighbor calling about a lost cat. "Hello," she answered, her voice a little more breathless than she intended. The voice on the other end was formal, imbued with an official gravity that sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Mrs. Reed, this is Lieutenant Commander Miller from the United States Coast Guard. I'm calling in conjunction with the Oregon State Police regarding your son, Liam Reed." Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat, a familiar pressure building behind her eyes. 40 years. 40 years she had lived with the phantom weight of that day, and in all that time the official calls had ceased, fading into the background hum of her grief. She had buried the expectation, the desperate, clawing hope, deep within herself, believing it a kindness to do so. Yet here it was, dredged up from the depths, as unwelcome and as terrifying as the ocean's darkest secrets. "This is about what, exactly?" Evelyn's voice, though strained, held a fragile edge of defiance. She clutched the receiver tighter, her knuckles white against the pale plastic. Lieutenant Commander Miller's voice, calm and measured, continued. "Mrs. Reed, we've recovered what we believe to be the private jet your son and his band were on when they disappeared in 1985. We need you to come to Port Astoria Naval Base." The words were a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole her breath. For 40 years, that plane, that moment, had been a gaping wound in her memory, a place where time had simply stopped. She had built a life around the absence, a quiet fortress of routine and resignation. And now, this. I don't have time for cruel jokes," Evelyn managed, her voice sharp with a sudden surge of anger, a defense mechanism against the wave of raw grief threatening to engulf her. "My son vanished decades ago. He's gone. I've accepted that. I don't want this peace, this fragile calm I've fought so hard for, to be disturbed by some macabre prank." With a trembling hand she slammed the receiver down, the abrupt click echoing in the sudden silence of her kitchen. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She leaned against the cool linoleum of the counter, her legs suddenly weak, the familiar scent of cinnamon from her morning toast now sickeningly sweet. The grief she had meticulously, painstakingly suppressed for so long, the grief that had threatened to consume her in the dark years after Liam's disappearance, now clawed at the surface, threatening to break through the carefully constructed barriers of her composure. It wasn't just Liam she had lost that terrible year. Shortly after the official declaration of the band's presumed demise, her husband, Arthur, had also been taken. The silence of the house, once filled with Liam's guitar riffs and Arthur's booming laughter, became a suffocating weight. Arthur, a man of booming laughter and unwavering optimism, had simply crumbled. The relentless questions, the endless, fruitless searches, the media frenzy. It had all been too much. He was diagnosed with severe melancholia and admitted to a private facility, a mental ward that promised solace but offered little. Though he was eventually declared stable and released 5 years later, returning to their home in Crescent Cove. A vital part of him had withered. He had retreated into himself, a ghost in his own house, distant from Evelyn and withdrawn from the community that had once known him as a vibrant, outgoing man. The stress of their son's disappearance had utterly transformed him, leaving behind a shell of the man she had loved. He passed away a decade later, never having truly emerged from the shadow of Liam's absence. Evelyn walked slowly, mechanically, back to her armchair by the window, her joints protesting with every step. She picked up her book, its familiar weight a comfort, but the words on the page blurred, meaningless symbols mocking her attempt at normalcy. The tranquility she had sought so desperately moments before was irrevocably shattered. The phone rang again, a jarring, insistent sound that pierced the fragile quiet. Once, twice, 3 times. Evelyn let it ring, her jaw tight, a stubborn resistance hardening her gaze. 4 times, 5, 6. The persistence was infuriating, a relentless invasion of her sanctuary. Finally, with a sigh of defeat, she picked it up. "I told you," she began, her voice weary, devoid of its earlier sharpness. This time, however, the voice on the other end was different, calmer, more professional. A woman's voice. "Mrs. Reed, please don't hang up. I'm Special Agent Dana Thorne from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I understand this is incredibly difficult to process, but the Coast Guard is not pranking you. We have indeed recovered the aircraft." Evelyn felt a sudden rush of conflicting emotions, disbelief, a sliver of terrifying hope, and an overwhelming surge of exhaustion. Her eyes pricked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought, I'll come. Thank you, Agent Thorne." The agent's voice softened slightly. "Do you need transportation, Mrs. Reed?" Evelyn shook her head, a reflexive gesture, though the agent couldn't see it. "No," she managed. "I'll manage." She hung up, her hands still shaking, and moved through her home in a daze. Her movements were automatic as she selected a simple navy dress and her most comfortable walking shoes. The world outside her front door seemed to shimmer, warped by the sudden brutal intrusion of the past into her carefully constructed present. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, making her way towards the bus stop, a familiar car pulled over silently beside her. The window rolled down, revealing the weathered, strained faces of Martha and George Dawson. Martha's voice was thick with unspoken emotion, her eyes wide and glistening. "Evelyn, are you heading to Port Astoria, too?" Evelyn simply nodded, unable to form words, the grief and shock too overwhelming. She recognized them instantly despite the passage of years. They were Marcus's parents. Marcus Dawson, the quiet, soulful drummer of the Obsidian Echoes, the one who had always kept the beat steady, both on stage and off. "Come with us," George offered, his voice hoarse as he reached across to open the back door. Evelyn gratefully accepted, sinking into the worn leather seat. The interior of the car smelled faintly of old coffee and forgotten dreams. Martha turned in her seat to face her, her hand reaching out to squeeze Evelyn's arm, a silent gesture of shared sorrow. "The Millers are on their way, too," Martha continued, her voice catching. "Chloe's older sister and her husband, and the Fosters, Sam's cousins, his parents. They passed a few years ago. Couldn't bear it anymore, I suppose." The drive took a few hours, a journey shrouded in a tense, aching silence, punctuated only by Martha's occasional sniffles and the hum of the road. Evelyn stared out the window, the familiar Oregon coastline blurring past, the endless gray of the ocean mirroring the turmoil in her heart. When they finally arrived at Port Astoria Naval Base, The sheer scale of the security was overwhelming. Uniformed Navy personnel mingled with stoic FBI agents, local police officers, and forensics teams in white suits. What appeared to be expedition scientists bustled about, their faces grimly focused. Agent Dana Thorne met them at the main gate, her badge gleaming in the muted afternoon light. She was younger than Evelyn had imagined, her sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle amidst the chaos. "I know this is incredibly difficult." She led them across the base, past rows of temporary tents and official vehicles, towards an open field. And then Evelyn saw it. Her breath caught, trapped in her lungs as if the air had been violently sucked from the world. There, in the stark, unyielding reality of the daylight, lay the fuselage of the private jet. The exact plane. Liam's plane. She remembered Arthur standing by its side, a proud smile on his face, snapping photographs with their old film camera before the band boarded, wanting to immortalize what he'd called their shooting star career. He had developed those photos himself, a tangible record of their dreams, a copy given to the police as evidence when the nightmare began. Now the plane sat before them, a skeletal ghost from the past, stripped bare by the ocean's unforgiving embrace. Rust streaked its once pristine white fuselage like weeping wounds. Seaweed, dark and stringy, clung to the wings like grotesque mourning shrouds. The vibrant red stripes that had once symbolized the fiery energy of the Obsidian Echoes were now faded to a somber, almost indistinguishable brown. It was a monument to shattered dreams, a testament to the passage of time and the cruelty of unanswered questions. The sight of the plane was a brutal awakening. It wasn't just metal and rust, it was a tomb, a stark, visceral reminder of a grief that had been abstract for so long. Evelyn felt a tremor run through her, a deep, unsettling vibration that resonated with the raw, unspoken pain etched on the faces of Martha and George Dawson, who stood beside her, their shoulders touching in a silent testament to their shared agony. Agent Thorne, seemingly aware of the emotional fragility of the moment, allowed them a few minutes of silent contemplation, her gaze empathetic yet resolute. "Mrs. Reed, Mr. and Mrs. Dawson," Agent Thorne finally broke the silence, her voice clear but respectful. "If you're ready, we can proceed to the identification area." She led them toward a large, climate-controlled tent, its white canvas stark against the gray Oregon sky. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, carrying the faint scent of disinfectant and something else. Something clinical, like a forgotten corner of a hospital. Rows of gurneys were arranged, each draped with a pristine white sheet. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting an unflattering, almost theatrical glow on the scene. A team of solemn-faced forensic specialists and medical examiners moved with practiced efficiency around the gurneys. Their hushed voices and somber expressions spoke volumes before a single sheet was lifted. Evelyn's heart pounded, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She held her breath, a silent plea to the universe for a miracle, even as a grim certainty began to settle deep within her. It was a macabre unveiling, a forced confrontation with the unimaginable. Agent Thorne nodded to one of the medical examiners, a tall, gaunt woman with kind, weary eyes. The woman approached the first gurney, her movements slow and deliberate. She paused as if gathering her own composure, then, with a deep breath, she reached down and gently pulled back the sheet. A collective gasp escaped the small group. On the gurney lay the body of Samuel "Sam" Crawford, the charismatic frontman of the Obsidian Echoes. Time, and the crushing embrace of the deep ocean, had not been kind. His face was a landscape of contusions, his once vibrant features now distorted, almost unrecognizable. His iconic curly hair, usually a wild halo around his head, was matted with what appeared to be dark, sandy sediment. Yet, despite the ravages, there was an undeniable familiarity, a ghostly echo of the vibrant young man who had once commanded stages with his powerful voice and boundless energy. Martha Dawson let out a soft whimper, her hand flying to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. George, ever the stoic, simply clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on Sam's still form, a profound sadness etched into every line of his face. The medical examiner moved to the next gurney. Another sheet was drawn back, revealing Chloe Turner, the quiet, observant bassist. Her long, dark hair, which she often braided with colorful ribbons, was spread around her head like a dark fan. Her features were less disfigured than Sam's, a haunting stillness in her expression as if she were merely sleeping. Evelyn remembered Chloe as the calm anchor of the band, a steady presence amidst the flamboyant personalities of her bandmates. A wave of nausea washed over Evelyn. Chloe, too, was gone. The scene unfolded with a chilling rhythm. The third sheet was lifted, revealing Marcus Dawson, the drummer. His usually mischievous eyes were closed, his face pale and serene, as if in a deep, eternal slumber. He was remarkably intact, almost untouched by the brutality of the crash, a stark contrast to Sam. George Dawson, who had remained stoic until this point, let out a guttural cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief that tore through the sterile air of the tent. He stumbled forward, a broken man, and Martha immediately rushed to his side, enveloping him in a tight embrace as they both wept openly. The collective sorrow in the tent was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Evelyn, however, remained frozen, her gaze fixed on the gurneys, her breath shallow. Her son, Liam, and Mick O'Brien, the drummer, were still unaccounted for. A sliver of desperate hope, irrational and fragile, began to bloom in the arid landscape of her despair. Could they have somehow survived? Could they have been thrown clear? Was there a chance? The thought was terrifying, almost sacrilegious in the face of the tragedy unfolding before her, yet it clung to her, a tenacious vine. The medical examiner, sensing the unspoken question in Evelyn's eyes, approached her. "Mrs. Reed," she began, her voice gentle, "we have identified 3 of the 4 individuals on board, Samuel Crawford, Chloe Turner, and Marcus Dawson. We have not found any trace of Liam Reed or Michael O'Brien." Her words were a bitter-sweet symphony. Relief, sharp and unexpected, mingled with a fresh wave of dread. Unfound did not mean alive, it meant unknown. It meant the agonizing limbo continued. "We also found something else, Mrs. Reed," Agent Thorne interjected, her voice now firm, pulling Evelyn's attention away from the lingering hope. She gestured towards a separate, smaller table where several specialists were meticulously examining fragments of the wreckage. "On the bodies, and throughout the fuselage, we found evidence of blunt force trauma and, in some cases, bullet wounds." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Bullet wounds. The quiet, sterile tent suddenly felt filled with a chilling wind. This wasn't just a plane crash. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This was something far more sinister, a brutal revelation that pierced through the carefully constructed narrative of a simple, inexplicable disappearance. The initial shock of seeing the wreckage, the grief of identifying the bodies, now morphed into a cold dread. The mystery had deepened, taken on a chilling new dimension. Evelyn felt a tremor in her hands. A plane crash was one thing. A natural disaster, however devastating, could be mourned. But bullet wounds. This implied malice, violence, a calculated act. It suggested a hidden truth far darker than she had ever dared to imagine. Her son. Was he involved in something? The thought was unbearable. Liam, with his easy smile and his passion for music, his head always in the clouds, dreaming of stadiums and roaring crowds. What could possibly connect him to such violence? Agent Thorne, observing Evelyn's horrified reaction, spoke again, her voice low and serious. Mrs. Reed, we understand this is an overwhelming amount of information. We don't have all the answers yet. Our investigation is just beginning, and we'll be exploring every possibility. But we wanted to provide you with this information as soon as possible." Evelyn could only nod, her mind reeling. The comforting, familiar world of Crescent Cove, the quiet routines, the carefully managed grief, it all seemed to recede, replaced by a terrifying new reality. The disappearance of the Obsidian Echoes was not a closed chapter. It was a gaping wound, and now it was bleeding. Secrets. And in that moment, despite the horror and the dread, a new resolve began to solidify within her. She had to know. She had to find out what truly happened to her son, even if the truth was far more horrifying than anything she had ever prepared for. The search was far from over. It had only just begun. The news of the recovered plane and, more importantly, the chilling revelation of bullet wounds on the deceased ripped through the quiet fabric of Crescent Cove like a rogue wave. For years, the town had lived with the unspoken tragedy of the Obsidian Echoes, a collective sigh of sorrow that had settled into the very air. Now, that sorrow was replaced by a simmering unease, a cold dread. The local news channels, sensing a story of immense public interest, descended upon Port Astoria Naval Base with a relentless ferocity, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward, hungry for details. Evelyn, still reeling from the events in the identification tent, found herself thrust into the blinding glare of the media spotlight. Agent Thorne, recognizing the profound impact of the discovery and the need to control the narrative, had arranged a brief press conference. Standing beside the grim, weathered fuselage of the jet, illuminated by a harsh floodlight in the encroaching twilight, Evelyn felt a strange, detached sense of unreality. The air hummed with the incessant clicking of camera shutters and the low murmur of questions. She could feel the collective gaze of a nation fixed upon her, a nation that had followed the story of the Obsidian Echoes disappearance with a mix of fascination and morbid curiosity for decades. "Mrs. Reed," a reporter's voice cut through the clamor, sharp and insistent. "What is your reaction to the findings? Do you believe your son, Liam, could still be alive?" The question hung in the cold evening air, loaded with a hope that felt almost cruel. Evelyn took a deep, shuddering breath, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the assembled journalists, then settling on the camera lenses, their unblinking eyes like silent, expectant witnesses. "My reaction," she began, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "My reaction is that a wound that was supposedly healed has been ripped open again. For 40 years, I have lived with the ghost of uncertainty. I have built a life around the absence of my son, and now, to learn that it was not a simple accident, that there was violence involved." Her voice faltered for a moment, her eyes welling with unshed tears. She paused, gathering her strength, then continued, her voice gaining a quiet, fierce power. "My son, Liam, and Michael O'Brien are still unaccounted for. Until I have definitive proof, until I see with my own eyes, I will cling to the hope that they are out there somewhere. And if they are, Liam, my boy, if you are listening, please come home. Your mother is waiting." Her plea, raw with emotion and maternal longing, resonated deeply with the American audience. It was a universal sentiment, the desperate hope of a mother for her lost child, transcending the grim details of the investigation. The moment was captured by every news outlet, amplifying her message across the nation, across the world. For a fleeting instant, the focus shifted from the macabre discovery to the human tragedy, to the agonizing hope that persisted against all odds. After the press conference, Agent Thorne gently guided Evelyn away from the media scrum, offering a quiet, private space within one of the temporary offices set up on the base. She poured Evelyn a cup of hot tea, its warmth a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep within her bones. "Mrs. Reed," Agent Thorne began, her voice earnest, "I want to be clear. While we cannot confirm the fate of your son and Mr. O'Brien at this time, the circumstances surrounding this discovery are highly unusual. We are treating this as a criminal investigation." Evelyn nodded, her mind still replaying the images of the battered fuselage, the serene, almost untouched face of Marcus Dawson juxtaposed with the contorted features of Sam Crawford. The bullet wounds. That was the detail that screamed at her, the anomaly that defied the simple explanation of a plane crash. "I need to know everything," Evelyn said, her voice firm, resolute, every single detail. "What happened to my son? What kind of trouble was he in?" Agent Thorne exhaled slowly. "Mrs. Reed, we are just beginning to piece together the events of that night. We'll be conducting extensive forensic analysis on the aircraft and the remains. We'll also be reviewing all the original case files, witness statements, and any other relevant information. This will take time." "Time is a luxury I don't have," Evelyn replied, her gaze unwavering. 40 years have passed. I've waited long enough." She thought of Arthur, his slow decline, the way the light had left his eyes. He had died without answers, without closure. Evelyn was determined not to share that fate. As the evening wore on, Agent Thorne, seeing the exhaustion etched on Evelyn's face, arranged for a car to take her back to Crescent Cove. The drive back was a blur. The news reports were already dominating the radio, the story of the Obsidian Echoes resurrected from the annals of cold cases. They played snippets of Evelyn's press conference, her voice fragile yet strong, carrying her plea into the night. Back in her quiet home, Evelyn found herself unable to sleep. The silence, once her refuge, now felt menacing, filled with the ghosts of questions. She wandered through the familiar rooms, her hand trailing along the dusty surfaces of old furniture, her mind replaying the events of the day. She stopped in front of a small antique mahogany cabinet in her living room. With trembling hands, she opened its glass doors. Inside, tucked away amidst old photographs and faded mementos, was a stack of vinyl records. The top one was Echoes of the Void, the Obsidian Echoes only album. Its cover, a vibrant psychedelic artwork, depicted a shadowy figure playing a guitar against a backdrop of swirling nebulae. Liam had poured his heart and soul into that album. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn grooves of the vinyl. And then, her gaze fell upon a photograph, tucked behind the record, a relic from a happier time. It was a snapshot Arthur had taken that morning, just before the flight. Liam stood by the plane, grinning, his guitar slung casually over his shoulder, his eyes bright with excitement. Beside him, Sam, Chloe, and Mick, all young, vibrant, full of life, their dreams stretched out before them like an endless horizon. Arthur had called it his good luck charm, a reminder of the joy and promise of their son's burgeoning career. He had wanted them to carry it with them. Now it was a stark reminder of what had been lost. Evelyn remembered the last conversation she had with Liam. He had been buzzing with excitement, talking about the big break they were about to catch, a lucrative deal that would catapult them to stardom. He had hinted at a major opportunity, a chance to bypass the usual grind, but had been vague on the details, saying he'd explain everything when he got back. She hadn't pressed him then, caught up in his enthusiasm. Now, a cold unease settled in her stomach. What big break could have led to bullet holes in a plane? What secret had Liam been keeping? Driven by a desperate need for answers, Evelyn decided to do something she hadn't done in decades. She tried to track down Arthur's old film camera, tucked away in the attic. She knew it held the original negatives of those last pictures. Perhaps, she thought in her quiet moments of desperation, they held some hidden clue, some forgotten detail that could shed light on the horror that had unfolded. She found it in a dusty box nestled amongst old holiday decorations and forgotten keepsakes. It was a sturdy, reliable camera, a testament to Arthur's meticulous care. She carefully removed the film roll, its metal canister cool against her fingertips. She would take it to the 1-hour photo lab in the morning, a ghost from the past developed in the present. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed, its gentle sound a stark contrast to the tumultuous storm raging within Evelyn. The night stretched before her, long and unforgiving. She curled up in her armchair, the photograph of Liam and his band clutched tight in her hand, the vinyl record of Echoes of the Void resting on her lap. The music, if she could bring herself to play it, would be a haunting melody, a requiem for lost dreams. But tonight, all she could hear were the unspoken questions, the lingering echoes of a 40-year-old mystery, now violently awakened. The search for truth, for her son, had just taken a dark and terrifying turn. And Evelyn, a woman who had simply wanted peace, now found herself at the precipice of a dangerous journey, pulled back into the terrifying current of the past. The next morning dawned gray and unforgiving, mirroring the tempest within Evelyn's soul. She had barely slept, the image of the corroded jet and the chilling words "bullet wounds" replaying endlessly in her mind. The photograph of Liam, vibrant and hopeful by the plane, was still clutched in her hand. The old film canister lay on her nightstand, a small, unassuming cylinder holding the potential for either solace or further devastation. She had to know. After a cup of lukewarm tea, Evelyn dressed, her movements stiff, almost automatic. The familiar comfort of her home felt alien, permeated by a sense of foreboding. She bypassed her usual routine of walking to the library, instead opting for the slightly longer drive to the nearest town with a 1-hour photo lab. The small, independently owned shop smelled of chemicals and old paper, a nostalgic aroma that transported her back to a simpler time when photographs were tangible treasures, not fleeting digital images. The young woman behind the counter with bright, curious eyes took the film canister with a cheerful, "No problem, ma'am, be ready in about an hour." Evelyn nodded, managed a weak smile, and retreated to the nearby coffee shop, the weight of the coming revelation pressing down on her. An hour later, the stack of glossy prints felt impossibly heavy in her hands. She paid the young woman, who offered a sympathetic smile, perhaps sensing the gravity of the images within the envelope. Evelyn couldn't wait until she was home. She found a quiet bench in a small park across the street, the damp morning air clinging to her. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the first print. It was a clear, crisp image of the band, laughing, their faces illuminated by the morning sun, standing on the tarmac before the jet. Liam, full of life, his guitar case propped against his leg. Sam, his arms slung around Chloe and Mick, all of them radiating youthful exuberance. She flipped through them quickly, her heart thumping. The usual pre-flight shots, the band members posing by the tail fin, adjusting their sunglasses, waving to Arthur, who was behind the camera. Then a few of Liam alone, a mischievous grin on his face as he gave a thumbs up. Each image was a dagger to her heart, a vivid reminder of the vibrant lives that had been extinguished so brutally. And then she saw it, a series of 3 consecutive shots taken just moments before boarding. In the first, the band was gathered, still laughing, but something was off. In the background, near the plane's open hatch, a figure stood. A man. He was partially obscured by the fuselage, his face turned away, but he was clearly not part of the band or the flight crew. He was dressed in a dark, nondescript suit, holding a small black briefcase. The second photo showed the man turning slightly, his profile briefly visible, a sharp, angular jawline, a prominent nose, and a pair of dark, intense eyes. He looked out of place, a stark contrast to the carefree musicians. His posture was rigid, almost menacing. He seemed to be looking directly at Arthur, who was taking the picture, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of annoyance or warning in his gaze. The third picture, taken a fraction of a second later, showed the man quickly turning his back again, his figure blending into the shadows cast by the plane. He seemed to be handing something to someone just inside the cabin, something small and dark that couldn't be clearly identified. Evelyn stared at the photographs, her blood running cold. This man. He had been there. Before they boarded, he was not supposed to be there. Arthur had never mentioned him, had never pointed him out. Why? Had he not seen him? Or had he simply dismissed him as a ground crew member, someone incidental? But the intensity of the man's gaze, the furtive exchange at the hatch, it felt significant, ominous. A wave of fear, cold and insidious, washed over Evelyn. This wasn't just a random stranger, he was connected. He was part of the missing piece of the puzzle. She carefully placed the 3 photographs back in the envelope, her mind racing. She had to show these to Agent Thorne. This was evidence. This was a lead. Back in her car, Evelyn's hands were still trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. Her quiet, measured world had been completely upended. She no longer felt like a passive observer of a 40-year-old mystery. She was actively, dangerously involved. The drive back to Crescent Cove, usually a peaceful journey, now felt charged with an unsettling urgency. As she pulled into her driveway, the familiar comfort of her small house was no longer there. A shadow seemed to cling to the porch, a subtle sense of being watched. She dismissed it as paranoia, a natural consequence of the day's revelations. But as she unlocked her front door, a faint creak from the back of the house sent a jolt of alarm through her. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, listening intently. Silence. Just the usual creaks and groans of an old house. She chided herself for being jumpy. She stepped inside, closing and locking the door behind her with a definitive click. The house was exactly as she had left it, tidy, quiet, perhaps a little too quiet. She walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. Then she saw it. On the small, ornate coffee table where she always kept her current book and a small, delicate porcelain teacup, there was a single, folded piece of paper. It hadn't been there when she left. A cold dread seeped into her bones, replacing the fear with a chilling certainty. Someone had been in her house while she was gone. She approached the table slowly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her breath caught in her throat as she unfolded the paper. It was a single sheet, typed, with no discernible letterhead. The words, stark and unambiguous, were a punch to the gut. Some truths are better left undisturbed. Continue to dig, and you will unearth more than you bargained for. For your sake, and for the sake of those you still hold dear, let the past remain buried. Your son is gone. Accept it. The message was unsigned, but its intent was clear. A direct threat, a warning, and it was personal. Your son is gone. The words echoed the very phrase she had spoken at the press conference, twisted and thrown back at her. How did they know? How did they know she was digging? The photographs. Had she been followed? Had they seen her at the photo lab? Evelyn stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a new, burning anger. This wasn't just about a cold case anymore. This was about her. And it meant her son, Liam, had been involved in something far bigger, far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The bullet wounds on the bodies of his bandmates were not an isolated incident. They were part of a larger, terrifying tapestry. She sank into her armchair, the piece of paper fluttering from her numb fingers to the floor. The comfort she had once sought in this quiet sanctuary was utterly obliterated. Her home had been violated, her fragile peace shattered. But amidst the fear, a new resolve solidified within her. They wanted her to stop. They wanted her to be silent. But now, more than ever, she would not. If this was a threat, it only confirmed that there was a truth to be found. A truth they desperately wanted to keep hidden. And Evelyn Reed, a 72-year-old woman who had nothing left to lose, would stop at nothing to uncover it. Her son's life, and perhaps his death, depended on it. The stark warning note, now crumpled in Evelyn's trembling hand, was a cold, undeniable reality. The initial shock began to morph into a simmering rage, a fierce determination that eclipsed her fear. They wanted her silent? They wanted her to give up? Not now. Not after she'd finally glimpsed the ugly truth lurking beneath the surface of Liam's disappearance. She would not be another victim of this nameless, faceless enemy. Her immediate impulse was to call Agent Thorne, the FBI. They would know what to do. But a moment of hesitation gnawed at her. This threat was personal. It was aimed directly at her in her own home, and it implied a level of surveillance that chilled her to the bone. What if involving the authorities too soon, without understanding the full scope of what she was up against, simply put her in more danger? What if these people were so deeply entrenched, so powerful that even the FBI couldn't protect her? The unsettling thought, born of a lifetime of consuming crime documentaries and thrillers, was a powerful deterrent. She decided for now to keep the discovery to herself. She needed to think. She needed to understand. Evelyn walked through her house, her senses heightened, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains sending a jolt of alarm through her. She checked the windows, ensuring they were locked. She double-checked the deadbolt on the front door. The feeling of violation lingered, a bitter taste in her mouth. She had to assume they were still watching. They wanted to intimidate her, to force her to retreat. But intimidation had never been Evelyn's strong suit. Grief had hollowed her, but it had also forged a core of steel. Her mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The mysterious man in Arthur's photographs, the bullet wounds, the threat. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple plane crash. Liam had been involved in something, and it wasn't just him. The entire band. The big break he'd mentioned, the lucrative deal. Had that been the bait? Had they been lured into something dangerous, something they couldn't escape? Evelyn remembered the band's former manager, Malcolm Vance, a name she hadn't uttered in decades, a man who had vanished from their lives almost as completely as the band itself after the plane disappeared. Malcolm was a flamboyant character, a self-proclaimed visionary with an almost pathological need for success. He had been the one to arrange the private jet, a lavish expense for a band that was, at the time, still struggling for mainstream recognition. He had always been obsessed with appearances, with projecting an image of opulence and success, even when their finances were strained. Evelyn had always found him a bit slippery. He talked a lot about networking and unconventional opportunities to get ahead. Could Malcolm have been involved in something illicit? Was he the one who had tangled the band in this web of danger? The thought sparked a new, unsettling possibility. Malcolm had been utterly devastated by the band's disappearance, so much so that he had completely withdrawn from the music industry, selling his management company and disappearing from public life. At the time, Evelyn had assumed it was grief, a man shattered by the loss of his clients and his livelihood. But what if it was fear? What if he knew something he was terrified to reveal? Evelyn found his old contact information buried deep in an old Rolodex, a relic from a bygone era. An address in a secluded, affluent community in the hills outside Los Angeles, and a phone number that had been out of service for years. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had besides the mysterious man in the photographs. She knew she couldn't just show up on Malcolm's doorstep. He was clearly a recluse, and a direct approach might only make him retreat further. She needed to be subtle. She needed to observe. She needed to find a way to assess whether he was a grieving former manager or a terrified co-conspirator. The next morning, Evelyn made arrangements for her house to be looked after by a trusted neighbor, a quiet, observant woman named Carol. She fabricated a story about visiting a distant relative who was ill, a plausible excuse that wouldn't raise any immediate suspicions. She packed a small bag, mostly containing practical clothes and her worn copy of Liam's album. She carefully tucked the developed photographs, especially the three crucial ones, into a padded envelope, deep within her handbag. The journey to Los Angeles was long and arduous. Evelyn, unaccustomed to such travel, felt every mile in her aging bones. The bustling chaos of LAX, the endless sprawl of the city, the sheer volume of people. It was a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of Crescent Cove. She rented a modest car, a sensible sedan that wouldn't draw attention, and navigated the bewildering freeways with a grim determination. Malcolm Vance's address led her to a secluded, gated community nestled in the Hollywood Hills, a world away from the gritty reality of downtown Los Angeles. The houses were sprawling, opulent, surrounded by manicured lawns and towering security fences. It was a place where secrets could be easily kept, shielded by wealth and high walls. She parked her car a discreet distance from his imposing gate, observing. The house itself was a sprawling, modern mansion, a testament to the kind of success Malcolm had always craved, but it looked desolate. The hedges were overgrown, the paint on the gate peeling in places. A single, dusty car, an older model luxury sedan, sat in the driveway covered in a thin layer of grime. It seemed the mansion, like its owner, had fallen into disrepair. Evelyn watched the house for hours. No one entered, no one left. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional distant hum of a gardener's leaf blower or the chirping of cicadas in the overgrown bushes. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible odor of decay, like something beautiful slowly withering. She decided to approach the house on foot to get a closer look. She walked slowly, casually, as if admiring the architecture, her senses on high alert. As she neared the gate, she noticed a security camera, small and unobtrusive, mounted on a pillar. It seemed functional, its red light blinking softly. So, Malcolm was still concerned about security. This was not the home of a man who had nothing to hide. She walked past the gate, pretending to be lost, then turned and walked back, her gaze lingering on the house. The windows were mostly obscured by heavy drawn curtains, but one on the second floor was slightly ajar. A faint, almost imperceptible smell drifted from it, the stale, musty odor of old cigarette smoke and something else, something cloying and sweet, like stale air trapped in a forgotten room. It was enough. Evelyn didn't need to confront him directly, not yet. Her instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, told her that Malcolm Vance was indeed here, and he was living a life of self-imposed imprisonment, a gilded cage built from fear or guilt. The desolate state of the once grand mansion, the perpetual drawn curtains, the air of neglect. It all painted a picture of a man haunted, a man in hiding. She returned to her car, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Malcolm knew something. His withdrawal, his reclusive lifestyle, the security around his home, it all pointed to a man who was either terrified of something or hiding from someone. Or both. The piece of paper with the chilling warning note flashed in her mind. Was Malcolm the source of that threat? Or was he another victim, trapped in the same dangerous web that had claimed Liam? Evelyn found a small nondescript motel a few miles away, far enough from the hills to be inconspicuous. She checked in under an assumed name, a small concession to the paranoia that was now her constant companion. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, Evelyn knew her journey was far from over. Malcolm Vance was a key, a very frightened, very silent key, and she had to find a way to unlock his secrets, to force him to speak before the shadows that had claimed her son 40 years ago and now threatened her, swallowed them all whole. The past, she realized with a chilling certainty, was not just undisturbed. It was actively, lethally, protecting itself. And she was now directly in its crosshairs. Evelyn spent the next few days in a state of heightened alert, a phantom chill always clinging to her skin. She kept the curtains drawn, locked her doors and windows, and even began to eye her usually friendly neighbors with a sliver of suspicion. The note on her coffee table, now tucked away in a locked box, was a constant, searing reminder of the danger that had breached her sanctuary. She knew she couldn't stay in Crescent Cove. It felt exposed, vulnerable. Her immediate priority was to confirm Malcolm Vance's involvement, or at least his knowledge, before she took any further action. She returned to the quiet, nondescript motel near Malcolm's secluded mansion. The subtle surveillance she had started became a full-blown, almost obsessive vigil. She drove by his estate at different times of the day and night, always keeping a safe distance, always watchful. The gates remained closed, the mansion dark and silent, a tomb of forgotten dreams and, perhaps, terrible secrets. The air of neglect only deepened, reinforcing her conviction that Malcolm was a prisoner, whether by choice or by force. The occasional glimpse of what she believed to be a shadowy figure moving behind the heavy curtains, or the faint glow of a television screen in the late hours, were the only signs of life. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Evelyn decided to take a risk. She parked her rental car down the winding road well out of sight of the security cameras and began to walk. The air in the Hollywood Hills was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the distant hum of city life, a stark contrast to the ocean spray of Crescent Cove. She moved slowly, carefully, her sensible shoes making barely a sound on the pavement. As she approached the mansion, she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer near the perimeter fence. It was a tripwire, a thin, almost invisible monofilament line expertly strung between two bushes. A professional setup. This wasn't just a paranoid recluse. This was a man who lived in fear of something tangible. Evelyn carefully skirted the tripwire, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved closer to the house, trying to find an angle that offered a better view, a hint of something more concrete. As she pressed herself against a low-hanging tree, she heard it, a low, guttural murmur coming from an open window on the ground floor. It was Malcolm's voice, raspy and slurred, punctuated by long silences. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was talking to himself. The words were indistinct, fragments of sentences, but the tone was unmistakable. Despair, paranoia, and a profound, agonizing fear. He sounded broken. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from inside the room, followed by a torrent of slurred, angry curses. It sounded like glass shattering. Malcolm was clearly in a very bad way. Evelyn weighed her options. She could retreat, call Agent Thorne, and report what she'd seen and heard, but the thought of leaving Malcolm in such a state, potentially in danger, gnawed at her. And what if he had information about Liam that only a direct confrontation could unlock? She felt a desperate urgency, a maternal instinct driving her forward. Ignoring the prickle of fear, Evelyn moved to the side of the house where a neglected patio door, partially obscured by overgrown vines, seemed less secure than the main entrance. The handle was old, tarnished, and with a careful, forceful twist, it gave way with a soft click. The heavy, sweet smell of stale air and something metallic, like old blood or rust, hit her first. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a television screen from deeper within the house. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light, making the air thick and oppressive. She stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The house was cold, as if it had been left unheated for years. The decor was still opulent, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs clung to the chandeliers, and discarded takeout containers littered the grand dining table. It was the house of a man who had completely given up on life, consumed by something dark and pervasive. Evelyn followed the faint murmur of voices, her footsteps barely audible on the thick, plush carpet. She found Malcolm in what appeared to be a lavish but utterly disheveled study. Empty liquor bottles were scattered across a sprawling mahogany desk, alongside overflowing ashtrays and crumpled papers. Malcolm himself was slumped in a large leather armchair, his once impeccably styled hair now greasy and matted, his expensive clothes stained and wrinkled. His face was gaunt, unshaven, his eyes bloodshot and vacant. He was muttering incoherently, clutching an old framed photograph to his chest. As Evelyn moved closer, she saw the photograph. It was a picture of the Obsidian Echoes, taken during a recording session. Liam, vibrant and laughing, was at the center. Malcolm, seeing the image, let out a choked sob. "My boys," he slurred, his voice thick with self-pity and despair. "My beautiful, foolish boys." Evelyn cautiously approached him. "Malcolm," she whispered, her voice soft, tentative. He startled, his head snapping up, his bloodshot eyes wide with terror. He looked at her as if seeing a ghost, his hand flying to his chest, clutching the photograph tighter. Who are you? How did you get in here? They'll kill me. They'll kill us all." He tried to rise, his movements uncoordinated, his legs buckling beneath him. "It's Evelyn Reed," she said, stepping into the faint light from the television screen. "Liam's mother." Recognition, slow and agonizing, dawned in his eyes, mingling with the fear. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't have come." He collapsed back into the chair, clutching his head, groaning. "They're watching. Always watching." "Who, Malcolm? Who is watching?" Evelyn pressed, her voice urgent. She knelt beside him, her hand gently touching his arm. His skin was clammy, his body radiating a palpable fear. He shook his head frantically, burying his face in his hands. "The deal. The goddamn deal. It was supposed to make us. It made us disappear." His words were a tangled mess of fear and regret, punctuated by gasps and shudders. Colombians. They had us. Arthur knew. He knew too much. He told me he wouldn't let them do it. He was supposed to stop it. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Arthur, her husband. He knew. He was involved? A new, terrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The years of Arthur's melancholia, his withdrawal. It wasn't just grief. It was guilt, or fear, or both. The big break Liam had mentioned. The luxurious private jet. Malcolm's frantic need for success. It all started to coalesce into a horrific picture. "What about the plane, Malcolm? The bullet wounds? What happened?" Evelyn demanded, her voice desperate. He lifted his head, his eyes haunted. "The cargo. They said it was just sensitive documents. But it was drugs. Millions. We were just a cover. The music, it was a smokescreen." He laughed, a bitter, broken sound that echoed in the silent room. "We were supposed to make a drop over the ocean. But someone found out. Rivals. They shot us down. Not just the plane, they shot at us, to make sure no one survived. It was a massacre." Evelyn gasped, a wave of nausea washing over her. A drug deal. A massacre. Not an accident. Not just a missing plane. Liam, her innocent, idealistic son, caught in the brutal crossfire of a drug war. "Liam and Mick, are they alive?" Evelyn whispered, barely daring to breathe. Malcolm's eyes, glazed with a mixture of alcohol and despair, met hers. He opened his mouth, a guttural sound escaping, but before he could speak, the front door burst open with a resounding crash that rattled the very foundations of the mansion. Two figures, tall and imposing, stood silhouetted against the night sky, their faces obscured by the dim light. They were dressed in dark clothes, their movements swift and silent. One of them held something that glinted wickedly in the faint light. Evelyn instinctively recoiled, a primal fear seizing her. Malcolm let out a terrified shriek, scrambling backwards into the corner of the room, clutching the photograph of the band to his chest like a shield. "No, please, I didn't say anything. I swear," he babbled, his voice a frantic, pathetic whimper. But it was too late. The figures advanced, their heavy footsteps echoing ominously in the silent house. One of them moved with chilling precision, a silent, deadly force. Evelyn saw a flash of metal, a blur of motion. She heard a sickening thud, a muffled groan, and then silence. Malcolm slumped forward, the photograph of his boys falling from his grasp, his body utterly still. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her legs feeling like lead. She was trapped. She had walked directly into a hornet's nest. The two figures turned, their faces still shrouded in shadow, and their gaze fell upon her, cold and unwavering. In that horrifying moment, Evelyn knew with absolute certainty that she had found the truth. But at what cost? The last thing she saw before a heavy hand clamped over her mouth and a rough cloth pressed against her face was the glint of something sharp in the hand of one of the men, and the lifeless eyes of Malcolm Vance staring blankly at the ceiling. The sweet, cloying smell of decay in the air now seemed to deepen, a chilling premonition of her own fate. The darkness consumed Evelyn. The rough cloth pressed against her face, its chemical scent burning her nostrils, sending her into a dizzying descent. She struggled, her muscles tensing, but the unseen hands were strong, unrelenting. A primal scream caught in her throat, a silent, desperate cry for Liam, for Arthur, for the life that was being ripped away from her. The world tilted, then spun into a vortex of black. She awoke to the dull ache in her head, the metallic tang of something bitter on her tongue. Her wrists were bound, not with harsh ropes, but with thick, industrial-strength zip ties that dug into her skin. Her ankles were also secured, preventing any attempt to escape. She was lying on a cold, concrete floor, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something chemical and acrid like old oil. The room was dark, utterly devoid of natural light, the only illumination coming from a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thrumming of what sounded like heavy machinery. Evelyn slowly pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. Her eyes, still adjusting to the dimness, scanned her surroundings. She was in a large, cavernous space, a warehouse perhaps, or an abandoned factory. Stacks of crates, covered with tarpaulins, lined the walls, creating a maze of shadows. The air was cool, almost cold and damp, suggesting a subterranean location or an old, unheated building. This was not the same secluded hideaway where Malcolm had been living. This was something else entirely. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a fluid, almost predatory grace. It was one of the men from Malcolm's house, the one who had subdued her. He was tall, powerfully built, with a hard, unyielding face and eyes that held no warmth, no flicker of humanity. He wasn't the man from Arthur's photographs. This was different. He carried himself with an air of lethal efficiency, a stark contrast to Malcolm's shambolic despair. He approached her, his gaze unwavering, and squatted down, bringing his face close to hers. Evelyn instinctively flinched, trying to pull away, but the zip ties held her fast. He didn't speak, but his presence was a chilling threat. He merely observed her, his eyes cold and assessing, like a predator examining its prey. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside, nestled against the plastic, were the 3 photographs from Arthur's camera, the ones showing the mysterious man by the plane. He held them up, just inches from her face, his lips curving into a slow, mocking smile. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn stared at the photographs, then back at his impassive face. They knew what she had. They had been watching her. The note, the break-in, the abduction. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. She wasn't just a nosy old woman. She was a threat, someone who had stumbled too close to a buried truth. The man then produced a smaller, sealed envelope. He tore it open with a deliberate slowness, revealing a single, typed sheet of paper. He unfolded it and held it out for Evelyn to read. It was a single line of text, cold and precise. Agent Thomason has been notified of your disappearance. He will be led to believe you fled due to the stress of the investigation. A surge of terror, cold and stark, coursed through Evelyn. They were manipulating the situation, creating a false narrative. They were cutting her off, isolating her. No one would be looking for her. No one would know where she was. She was utterly alone, adrift in this terrifying subterranean world. The man stood up, his gaze still fixed on her. He turned and walked back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Evelyn was left alone in the vast, echoing space, bound and helpless. The rhythmic thrumming of the machinery grew louder, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the concrete floor. It was a constant, unsettling presence, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. Hours passed, stretching into an eternity. Evelyn's muscles ached, her mouth was dry, and her mind raced, cycling through fear, anger, and a desperate struggle to understand. What did they want with her? Why keep her alive? And who were they? The men from Malcolm's house. The man in Arthur's photograph. The drug deal. It was all a tangled web of violence and secrecy, and she was caught in its suffocating threads. The thought of Liam, her gentle, music-loving son, caught in this brutal underworld, gnawed at her. Had he been a willing participant? Or had he been coerced, a pawn in a dangerous game far beyond his understanding? The notion that her son, even if alive, might be complicit in such darkness was a new, agonizing layer of grief. The rhythmic thrumming intensified, accompanied by a low, grinding sound. A section of the concrete wall at the far end of the warehouse began to slide open, revealing a blinding white light and a cacophony of voices and sounds. Evelyn squinted, trying to discern what was happening. Large vehicles, their engines roaring, slowly emerged from the opening, their tires churning on the rough floor. They were unmarked, industrial trucks, their cargo bays covered with heavy tarpaulins. They looked like they were transporting something massive, something valuable. As the trucks passed, a gap in the stream of vehicles revealed a fleeting glimpse of what lay beyond the sliding wall. It wasn't a loading dock or another part of the warehouse. It was a vast, subterranean tunnel, expertly constructed, stretching into the darkness, its walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits. The air, even from this distance, felt different, cleaner, but still tinged with the acrid smell of chemicals and the faint aroma of something metallic. This was an operation, a massive, clandestine enterprise. The trucks continued to rumble past, their exhaust fumes filling the already oppressive air. Evelyn, despite her fear, felt a spark of perverse curiosity. She had stumbled upon something enormous, something that went far beyond a simple drug deal gone wrong. This was an organization, powerful and deeply entrenched, operating in the shadows, its tentacles reaching far and wide. Then the last truck passed and the sliding wall began to close with a slow, grinding hiss. The light diminished and the sounds faded, returning the warehouse to its suffocating dimness and the unsettling thrum of the machinery. Evelyn was left alone once more, the cold reality of her situation settling upon her. She was not merely a hostage, she was a witness. And witnesses in this world rarely survived. But a strange sense of defiance began to stir within her. Her terror was still palpable, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered by a burning resolve. She had found the truth, or at least a glimpse of it, and she would not let them silence her. Not now, not after she had come so far, lost so much, and finally, terrifyingly, gotten so close to understanding what truly happened to her son. The game had changed. It was no longer about closure for Evelyn Reed. It was about survival, and perhaps, just perhaps, about a desperate final attempt to bring these people and the truth to light. But first she had to find a way to escape. The chemical cloud, a potent cocktail of fear and sedatives, clung to Evelyn, dragging her deeper into the abyss of unconsciousness. The last image seared into her mind was the lifeless form of Malcolm Vance, a stark testament to the deadly consequences of his broken silence. She was now undeniably a witness, a dangerous liability in the eyes of those who had snatched her. Her next awakening was even more disorienting. The dull throb in her head had intensified into a pounding agony, each beat resonating with the frantic thrumming of unseen machinery. The air was colder, thick with a damp, metallic tang that spoke of raw earth and industrial processes. Her body felt heavy, her limbs like lead, the zip ties still biting into her wrists and ankles. She was no longer on a concrete floor. Instead, a crude, thin mattress offered scant comfort beneath her. The single bare bulb overhead cast a sickly yellow glow on her immediate surroundings. The space was a makeshift cell, a rough-hewn enclosure constructed from corrugated metal sheets. Beyond the flimsy walls, the vast, echoing space of the warehouse loomed, still shrouded in oppressive darkness. The rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the very floor, a constant, unsettling pulse that seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth. It was a sound that now instilled a deep, primal fear. Hours, or perhaps days, blurred into an indistinguishable haze. Evelyn's concept of time became distorted, marked only by the shifting intensity of the hum and the occasional appearance of a shadowy figure, silent and imposing, who would leave a bottle of water and a plate of cold, unappetizing food just within her reach. They never spoke, never made eye contact, their movements precise and efficient. She was a problem to be contained, not a person to be acknowledged. During these stretches of enforced solitude, Evelyn's mind, despite the lingering effects of the sedatives, began to clear. She replayed Malcolm's fragmented confession, the words swirling in her consciousness. The deal, Colombians, cargo, drugs, shot us down, massacre, and then the most agonizing detail. Arthur knew. The revelation about her husband, a man she had loved and mourned, twisted her grief into something bitter and confused. Had his melancholia been born not just of loss but of complicity, of a horrifying secret he couldn't bear to live with or to reveal? The implications were staggering. Her beloved Arthur, perhaps unwittingly at first, had been drawn into this sinister underbelly. He had photographed the plane, he had watched Liam board. Had he seen the mysterious man from his own photographs and understood his significance? Had he tried to stop it, as Malcolm claimed? The questions clawed at her, each one more agonizing than the last. The tragedy of Liam's disappearance was now compounded by the agonizing thought of her husband's secret torment. One evening, after what felt like an eternity, the grinding sound returned. Louder this time, closer. The corrugated metal wall of her cell slid open with a screech, revealing not the shadowy figures she had grown accustomed to, but a new presence. He was different from the silent enforcers. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in expensive, tailored clothing, though his attire seemed almost absurdly out of place in the grimy warehouse. His face was sharp, almost hawkish, with piercing, intelligent eyes that held a chilling absence of empathy. His silver hair was slicked back, meticulously groomed. He carried himself with an air of authority, a quiet menace that was far more terrifying than the brute force of her captors. He was the man from Arthur's photographs, the man who had been by the plane. Evelyn's breath hitched. Here he was, the one who started it all, or at least the one closest to the origin. He stared at her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice smooth, cultured with a faint, unidentifiable accent. "A pleasure to finally make your acquaintance, though I confess I had hoped it would be under less constrained circumstances for you." Evelyn, still bound, pushed herself up as much as her restraints allowed, her gaze unwavering. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice hoarse from disuse. He chuckled, a low, dry sound that held no humor. "Names are irrelevant, Mrs. Reed. What matters is the truth. And you, it seems, have a regrettable habit of pursuing inconvenient truths." He stepped closer, surveying her with an air of clinical detachment, as if she were a specimen under a microscope. "Your inquiries into Malcolm Vance, your newfound interest in those old photographs. Careless. Extremely careless." He pulled a chair from the corner of the cell, its legs scraping against the concrete, and sat down opposite her, crossing one leg over the other. He exuded an aura of calm control, a stark contrast to Evelyn's terror. Malcolm, unfortunately, proved to be unreliable, a regrettable necessity, but his loose tongue is no longer a concern. Evelyn felt a fresh wave of nausea. He had ordered Malcolm's death. This man was the murderer. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Information," he replied, his eyes cold and unwavering. "And cooperation. You have, quite unwittingly, stumbled upon a very sensitive operation, one that has been carefully built over decades. Your son, Liam, and his friend, Michael, were integral, shall we say, to a very crucial phase of this operation. And now you are too." Evelyn stared at him, her mind racing. "Integral? What are you talking about? Liam was a musician. He wasn't involved in anything like this." The man smiled, a humorless baring of teeth. "Oh, but he was, Mrs. Reed. More than you could possibly imagine. Young Liam and Michael, they were always resourceful, even after the unfortunate incident with the plane, an act of aggression by a rival faction, a misunderstanding that unfortunately cost us valuable cargo and personnel. Your son, however, possessed a unique set of skills. Adaptability, loyalty, and a certain ruthlessness when provoked. Qualities we found immensely useful." A horrifying realization began to dawn on Evelyn. "You mean Liam survived?" The words were barely a whisper, a fragile hope mixed with an agonizing dread. The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it filled the small cell with a chilling intensity. "Indeed, he did, and he thrived. He and Michael were brought into our organization, offered a choice, a swift, brutal end, or a new life, a new purpose. They chose wisely, they chose life, and they chose to be loyal. They rose through the ranks, Mrs. Reed. Far beyond their initial, shall we say, transport duties. They became indispensable." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Liam, a part of a drug cartel? A ruthless organization that murdered without hesitation. Her innocent boy transformed into a cold-blooded criminal? The vision was too grotesque, too impossible to reconcile with the memory of her son. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, you're lying. Liam would never—" "People change, Mrs. Reed," the man interrupted, his voice devoid of sympathy, "especially when faced with the stark choice between life and death. Your son, given his talents, became a very effective asset. He found a new kind of power, a new kind of influence, a life far more substantial than playing rock music in dive bars." He paused, his gaze fixed on her. "And now, Mrs. Reed, you have a choice. You can continue to resist, to push for answers, to expose what you believe to be the truth. And in doing so, you will only guarantee your own demise and, perhaps more importantly, put your son in an impossible position. Or you can cooperate. You can become a part of this, just as he did, and you will see him, alive, and in a position of significant power within our structure." He produced a small sealed bottle from his pocket. "Or," he said, his voice hardening, "you can choose to be uncooperative, and we will ensure you are never found. Your disappearance will be permanent, a tragic footnote in the ongoing mystery of the lost rock band's mother. And your son, if he ever learns of your fate, will know it was your own foolish stubbornness that brought it about." He then placed the bottle on the cold concrete floor, just out of her reach. "This, Mrs. Reed, is a powerful sedative. You will take it every day. It will ensure your cooperation and your continued good health. It will allow you to adapt, to become a part of this, to understand your new purpose." He stood, his shadow looming over her. "You are now a part of the family, Mrs. Reed, a very exclusive, very dangerous family, and your son, Liam, is waiting for you." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had come. The corrugated metal wall slid shut with a final echoing screech, plunging Evelyn back into the suffocating darkness. The rhythmic thrumming of the machinery was no longer just a sound. It was the heartbeat of her new prison, the grim soundtrack to her terrifying, inescapable reality. She stared at the small bottle on the floor, its dark liquid glinting menacingly in the dim light. Her son was alive, but he was a stranger, and she was a prisoner, about to be forced to become a part of the very world that had consumed him. The true horror had only just begun. The words, "You are now a part of the family," echoed in Evelyn's mind, a chilling mantra in the oppressive darkness. The memory of the man's smooth, predatory voice, his cold eyes, sent shivers down her spine. He had offered her a choice, but it was no choice at all, cooperation or utter oblivion. And the price of that cooperation was the ultimate betrayal of her own identity, a surrender to the monstrous reality of her son's new life. The rhythmic thrumming of the machinery intensified, vibrating through the thin mattress beneath her, a constant, physical reminder of her confinement. She looked at the small, dark bottle he had left, glinting menacingly in the dim light. A powerful sedative, he had called it. A tool of control, a chemical leash to ensure her compliance. She felt a surge of defiance, a stubborn refusal to submit. But what alternative was there? Starvation? Torture? Or worse, never knowing the full truth about Liam? Hours, or perhaps an entire day, passed in agonizing silence. Evelyn's body ached. Her throat was parched, but a deeper thirst. A thirst for answers gnawed at her. She watched the bottle, its presence a constant, taunting reminder of her predicament. The silence pressed in on her, amplifying her fears, her doubts. She imagined Liam, not as the innocent, guitar-slinging boy she remembered, but as the ruthless asset described by the man. The thought was unbearable, yet it was the only link she had to him, the only path to understanding. Finally, driven by a desperate, agonizing calculus of survival and the slim hope of seeing Liam, Evelyn reached for the bottle. Her hand trembled as she unsealed it, the click of the cap echoing loudly in the silence. The liquid inside was clear, almost colorless, but she could feel its insidious power radiating from the glass. She hesitated for a long moment, her breath hitched in her throat. This was it. The moment she irrevocably crossed a line, a point of no return. With a final, agonizing decision, a silent prayer for a strength she wasn't sure she possessed, she raised the bottle to her lips and swallowed its contents. The liquid was tasteless, yet almost immediately a heavy drowsiness began to wash over her. Her limbs grew heavy, her thoughts sluggish, disconnected. The bare bulb above her seemed to dim, its light fading into a blurry haze. The rhythmic thrumming of the machinery became a distant, muffled roar, like the ocean from a great distance. She felt herself sinking, a profound fatigue pulling her down, into the depths of a forced, unnatural sleep. When she awoke, the world felt softer, muted. The edges of her cell were less sharp, the light from the bare bulb less harsh. The constant thrumming of the machinery seemed to have receded, a faint echo in the background of her consciousness. Her body felt strangely light, almost disconnected from her mind. The gnawing fear that had been her constant companion was still there, but it was distant, muffled, as if viewed through a thick pane of glass. The sedative, she realized, had done its work. The sliding metal wall of her cell opened once more, but this time, the figure that emerged was different. Not the silent, menacing enforcer, nor the smooth, terrifying leader. This was a man of average height and build, his face unremarkable, almost forgettable. He wore plain, dark clothing, and his eyes, though alert, held no malice, only a weary resignation. He carried a tray with a glass of water and a plate of food, a small, bland piece of grilled chicken and some steamed vegetables. He was a courier, a facilitator, a cog in this vast, unseen machine. He placed the tray on the floor, just within her reach, and then, to Evelyn's surprise, he spoke. His voice was soft with a distinct Spanish accent, but his English was clear. "Buenos dias, señora. Eat, drink. You will feel better." He did not wait for a reply, simply turned and began to gather the empty water bottle and the previous day's untouched food. Where am I?" Evelyn managed, her voice raspy, unfamiliar to her own ears. The man paused, his back to her, and spoke without turning around. "You are safe, señora, for now. You are being moved to a new place, a better place." His tone was devoid of emotion, a mere relay of information. "Moved? Where?" Evelyn pressed, a flicker of panic rising within her. He finally turned, his gaze briefly meeting hers, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Pity? Regret? In his eyes. "South, señora. You are going south." He picked up the tray and moved towards the open cell door. "It will be a long journey. Rest." He slid the wall shut once more, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. South. The word hung in the air, echoing with implications. Mexico. The cartels. Liam. A chilling sense of inevitability settled over her. She was being transported, like cargo, deeper into the heart of this dark empire. She ate the bland food mechanically, her mind churning. The sedative had blunted her fear, but it had also sharpened her resolve. She was no longer just a victim, she was a survivor. And she was going to see Liam. Even if he was a stranger, even if he was a monster, she had to see him, she had to understand. After what felt like another endless stretch of time, the grinding sound returned and the metal wall slid open once more. This time, the space outside was bathed in the harsh, almost blinding light of powerful floodlights. The air was colder, crisper, and Evelyn could hear the distinct roar of powerful engines. Two new figures, larger and more imposing than the previous one, entered her cell. Their faces were shadowed by the glare, their movements brusque. They unbound her ankles first, then her wrists, the zip ties snapping with a sharp, final sound. Evelyn's muscles screamed in protest as they pulled her roughly to her feet. Her legs, weak from disuse and the lingering effects of the sedative, threatened to buckle beneath her. She swayed, her head spinning, but their grip was firm, unyielding. They half-dragged, half-supported her out of the cell and into the vast, brightly lit warehouse. The space was a hive of activity. Men in dark clothes moved purposefully, loading crates onto the same type of unmarked industrial trucks she had glimpsed before. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and exhaust fumes. The thrumming sound was deafening now, the roar of engines echoing off the concrete walls. Evelyn's eyes, still adjusting, caught a glimpse of something beyond the open bay door of the warehouse. It was a vast, open expanse, illuminated by the floodlights stretching into the night. It wasn't a loading dock or a road, it was an airfield, a private airfield hidden deep within this sprawling complex. Small, twin-engine planes like the one Liam had vanished in were parked on the tarmac, their propellers still, and a much larger, darker aircraft, a cargo plane, was being meticulously loaded, its huge rear ramp open like a gaping maw. She was not going by truck. She was going by air. The two men continued to propel her forward, their grip like iron. She could hear them speaking in rapid, hushed Spanish, their words a meaningless jumble. As they neared one of the unmarked trucks, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted from behind the cargo plane. A brief, muffled explosion, then silence, instantly followed by a flurry of shouts and frantic movement from the men in the warehouse. The two men holding Evelyn paused, momentarily distracted, their heads snapping towards the source of the commotion. In that split second of confusion, Evelyn, fueled by a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, twisted violently, pulling free from their grasp. She stumbled, her legs threatening to give out, but somehow she found her footing. She ran, blindly, instinctively towards the maze of stacked crates, seeking cover in the shadows. She heard shouts behind her, angry Spanish curses. Footsteps pounded onto the concrete floor, closing in. Her lungs burned, her heart hammered against her ribs, but she pushed herself harder, weaving through the towering stacks, the smell of damp earth and oil intensifying. She had to get away. She had to. This was her only chance. The explosion, whatever it was, had given her a brief, unexpected window of opportunity. She wasn't just a passenger in their game anymore. She was a fugitive, and for the first time in days, a sliver of desperate, animalistic hope ignited within her. She was not dead yet. Not yet. Evelyn ran, her body fueled by a desperate, animalistic instinct. The shouts behind her grew louder, closer. She could hear the heavy thud of boots on the concrete floor, the frantic urgency in the Spanish commands. Her lungs burned, each breath a searing agony, but the thought of Liam and the horrifying revelations about his fate propelled her forward. She wove through the towering stacks of crates, their tarpaulin covers brushing against her, offering fleeting moments of concealment before she emerged into the harsh, unforgiving light of the floodlights. The warehouse was immense, a labyrinth of shadows and metal. She could still hear the distant roar of the cargo plane's engines, a tantalizing whisper of escape. But the men were closing in. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Two figures, large and menacing, were gaining on her, their faces grim, their intent clear. They moved with a chilling efficiency, cutting off her angles, forcing her deeper into the heart of the complex. Suddenly, a voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the din, speaking in heavily accented Spanish. It was the man from Arthur's photographs, the one who had confronted her in the cell. The leader. He appeared from behind a row of trucks, his tailored suit strangely out of place in the grimy warehouse. He wasn't running, but moving with a deliberate, confident stride, knowing she couldn't escape. Evelyn darted between two massive cargo containers, their cold steel sides a temporary shield. She pressed herself against the corrugated metal, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was cornered. There was nowhere left to go. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and something else, something cloying and metallic like fresh blood. A loud clang echoed through the warehouse as one of the men struck a stack of metal barrels in frustration. Evelyn flinched, instinctively pulling back further into the narrow space. She heard their heavy breathing, their terse whispers just inches away on the other side of the containers. They were waiting. They were toying with her. Suddenly, a section of the container wall before her seemed to shimmer, then shift. A narrow, almost imperceptible seam, barely visible in the dim light, stretched vertically down the metal. With a faint click, a hidden door, no wider than Evelyn's own body, opened inwards. A figure emerged from the darkness beyond, a man whose face was shrouded by the shadows, but whose presence sent a jolt of recognition through her. It was Liam. But not the Liam she remembered. Not the boy with the carefree grin and the bright, idealistic eyes. This man was taller, broader, his shoulders set with a dangerous confidence. His face, though still undeniably her son's, was harder, etched with lines of experience and a cold, almost predatory stillness. His eyes, in the faint light, held a depth she didn't recognize, a chilling absence of the warmth she remembered. He was dressed in dark, tactical clothing, a stark contrast to the ripped jeans and band t-shirts of his youth. A pistol was holstered at his hip, its metal glinting faintly. Evelyn stared, her mind struggling to reconcile the image before her with the boy she had raised. This was a ghost, a terrifying, living ghost. Liam, if it truly was him, did not speak. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers for a fleeting second, a silent acknowledgment that contained no warmth, no comfort. He merely gestured with his head, a terse, silent command for her to follow. The choice was clear, the men pursuing her, or this hardened stranger who wore her son's face. Without a second thought, Evelyn slipped through the narrow opening, the hidden door closing silently behind her, plunging her into a new, oppressive darkness. The air was colder here, damp, carrying the faint, earthy smell of rock and stagnant water. She was in a narrow, rough-hewn tunnel, barely wide enough for one person descending at a steep angle. The rhythmic thrumming of the machinery was louder here, vibrating through the very rock. Liam moved ahead of her with an unnerving familiarity, his footsteps barely audible. Evelyn struggled to keep up, her weakened legs protesting with every step. The tunnel was unlit, forcing her to rely on the faint glow emanating from Liam's form, a strange, almost ethereal light that seemed to guide her through the subterranean passage. The air grew heavier, thick with a sense of claustrophobia that pressed in on her. They continued their silent descent for what felt like an eternity, the rhythmic thrumming growing into a deafening roar. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space, a subterranean city of industry. Evelyn gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was a massive underground complex, carved deep into the earth. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and the faint, unmistakable odor of processing. The space was brilliantly lit by a series of powerful industrial lights, revealing a staggering operation. Rows upon rows of sophisticated machinery whirred and hummed, their complex mechanisms processing a continuous stream of raw material. Pipelines snaked along the cavern walls, disappearing into the depths. Men in jumpsuits moved purposefully, overseeing the process, their faces grim and focused. This was not merely a warehouse, it was a factory, a clandestine, illegal factory. Evelyn saw huge vats, their contents bubbling and churning, emitting plumes of vapor. The air was acrid, burning her nostrils, making her eyes water. This was a drug manufacturing operation, massive in scale, hidden deep beneath the earth, churning out vast quantities of illicit substances. The understanding hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was what Liam was involved in. This was his new purpose. Liam, seemingly oblivious to her shock, continued to lead her through the bustling complex, his demeanor one of calm authority. Men in jumpsuits nodded respectfully as he passed, some even saluting. He moved with an effortless command, a figure of power within this terrifying subterranean world. The idealistic musician, the gentle boy, was gone. In his place stood a man forged in the crucible of this dark empire, a man who commanded respect and instilled fear. They reached a secluded section of the cavern, hidden behind a series of soundproofed panels. The rhythmic thrumming of the machinery was muffled here, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum. Liam pushed open a heavy, steel door, revealing a surprisingly plush, though still stark, living space. It was a private apartment carved into the rock, far removed from the grime and chaos of the factory. A large, comfortable bed, a small table, a few chairs. Spartan, yet luxurious in its isolation. Inside, sitting at the small table, was Michael O'Brien, the drummer. His face, once open and jovial, was now gaunt, his eyes hollowed and distant. He was thinner, his hair longer and unkempt, but it was unmistakably Mick. He looked up as they entered, his gaze meeting Evelyn's with a flicker of something akin to recognition. A flash of the old Mick quickly extinguished. He simply nodded, a silent, almost mechanical gesture. Liam finally spoke, his voice low and flat, devoid of emotion. "Mother, welcome to your new home." There was no warmth, no affection in his tone. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of ownership. Evelyn stared at him, her heart aching with a profound, desolate sadness. Her son was alive. He was here. But he was lost to her, transformed into something unrecognizable, something cold and dangerous. She was in a gilded cage, trapped in the heart of this monstrous operation, a prisoner of her own relentless search for truth. The ultimate irony. She had found Liam, but she had lost him irrevocably in the process. And as she looked at Michael, his eyes empty, his spirit seemingly broken, Evelyn knew, with a chilling certainty, that the price of survival in this world was often far higher than the price of death. The true horror was not just what had happened to Liam, but what he had become. The cold, sterile comfort of the private apartment, so incongruous with the brutal reality of the underground factory, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. Evelyn sat on the edge of the plush bed, her gaze fixed on Liam, who stood across the room, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask. Michael O'Brien, slumped in a chair by a small steel table, seemed to fade into the background, a ghost haunting his own living prison. The heavy steel door, now closed, seemed to seal them all into this terrifying new existence. "Liam," Evelyn whispered, her voice raw with an agony that transcended the sedative's numbing effects. Is this really you?" He finally moved, a slow, deliberate turn, his eyes, so like her own, but devoid of their former warmth, meeting hers. "It's me, Mother," he said, his voice flat, emotionless, just different. Time changes everyone. There was no inflection, no hint of the melodic rhythm that had once defined his speech. This was not the son who had once filled their home with guitar riffs and boundless laughter. This was a man forged in a different kind of fire. "Different? Liam, what have you become?" Her voice cracked, tears finally spilling over, tracing hot paths down her dust-streaked cheeks. "Malcolm said it was drugs. A massacre. They shot you down." Liam's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He walked to the small table, poured himself a glass of water, and took a long drink. Michael didn't stir. "Malcolm was a fool," Liam stated, his voice devoid of anger, merely a statement of fact. "He got us into this. He owed them, heavily. He thought he could use us, use the band as a cover, a one-time deal. He underestimated them." He paused, his gaze drifting to the far wall as if replaying the horrific events in his mind. "The plane was supposed to carry a very valuable cargo, under the guise of our tour equipment. We were young, stupid, blinded by the promise of fame and a shortcut to the top. Malcolm sold us a dream, and it turned out to be a nightmare." Evelyn watched him, transfixed, her heart a tangled knot of grief and burgeoning understanding. "So, you were delivering drugs?" Liam finally met her gaze again, his eyes cold and unwavering. "We were. A large shipment from Colombia to the West Coast. We were supposed to make a mid-ocean transfer to a smaller vessel. But a rival faction. They had been tipped off. They intercepted us. Mid-flight, they weren't interested in the cargo. They wanted to send a message, a brutal, unambiguous message." He walked to the single small window, which looked out onto a stark, unadorned rock face, and stood with his back to her. "The plane was hit. Engines failed. We started going down. It was chaos. Sam, Chloe, they were in the main cabin. They were hit first, caught in the crossfire." His voice remained flat, but a subtle clenching of his fists betrayed a deeper emotion, a raw, suppressed memory. Michael and we were in the back, in the cargo hold, securing the cargo. We had just enough time to grab emergency oxygen and strap ourselves into a reinforced compartment before impact. Evelyn listened, her breath held captive in her chest. The methodical, almost clinical way he recounted the horror was terrifying. This wasn't the Liam who would have screamed, who would have cried. This was a survivor, hardened by unimaginable brutality. When we hit the water, Liam continued, his voice a low monotone, it was a miracle we survived. The impact tore the plane apart. We were flung clear, deep into the ocean. The cargo hold, ironically, saved us. It sank, but slowly. We managed to get out to the surface before it pulled us under completely. He turned back to her, his gaze intense. We were adrift for days. Hypothermia, dehydration. We thought we were going to die. He walked over to Michael, who still sat motionless, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Michael flinched, then, slowly, robotically, looked up at Liam. He saw things, Liam explained, his voice softening just a fraction, a ghost of his old self. Things no one should ever have to see. It broke him. Then what happened? Evelyn asked, her voice barely a whisper. Liam looked from Michael to Evelyn, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. They found us. Not the Coast Guard. Not the Navy. Them. He gestured vaguely to the walls around them, to the unseen machinery beyond. A search party. The cartel. They didn't know if anyone had survived the attack. They found us, barely clinging to life. They recognized us from the manifest, from Malcolm's arrangements. He paused, and for the first time, Evelyn saw a flicker of the old Liam, a momentary vulnerability in his eyes. They gave us a choice, Mother. Join them. Work for them. Or disappear. Permanently. They needed people with our unique set of skills, our adaptability, our ability to blend in. Our background provided the perfect cover. Who would suspect two rock musicians of being involved in something like this? He gave a short, bitter laugh, devoid of humor. We had nothing, no home, no future, no choice, really. We chose to live. And you became a part of this? Evelyn's voice was filled with a mixture of horror and despair. Liam walked to the small steel table and picked up a gleaming, wickedly sharp knife, testing its edge with his thumb. His movements were precise, confident. I learned, Mother, quickly, what it takes to survive in this world, what it takes to protect what little you have left. The weak are consumed. The strong, they adapt. I adapted. I learned to control, to lead. He looked at the knife, then back at her, his eyes cold and unyielding. I rose through the ranks. I became indispensable. Michael, he's still with me. I protect him. He's all I have left of the old life. Evelyn felt a profound sorrow settle over her. Her son was alive, but he was a stranger, a ghost inhabiting the shell of her boy. The innocent dream of rock and roll had been twisted into a nightmare of drugs and violence. She looked at the pistol holstered at his hip, the cold, calculating look in his eyes, the almost clinical detachment with which he spoke of death and survival. He was not the boy she had lost, nor was he the hero she had desperately hoped to find. He was a product of this brutal, unforgiving world. And you brought me here to be a part of this? Evelyn's voice was filled with a desperate, hopeless plea. Liam placed the knife back on the table. You were becoming a liability, Mother, asking too many questions, digging too deep. The man who spoke to you earlier, the one who found you at Malcolm's, he is a very powerful figure in our organization. He wanted you eliminated, but I intervened. He paused, and a flicker of something almost tender, almost human, crossed his face, a fleeting shadow of the son she knew. You are my mother. I would not allow that. You will be safe here. You will have everything you need, but you will not leave. and you will not interfere." He walked to the heavy steel door, his back to her, his voice firm and final. "You will take the sedative every day. It is for your own good. It helps you adapt. It helps you accept." He opened the door, and the muffled thrumming of the machinery instantly filled the room, a grim reminder of their inescapable reality. "We are a family, Mother, and now you are truly one of us." As he stepped out, closing the door behind him with a resonant thud, Evelyn was left alone with Michael, the silent, broken shadow of a man. The sedative dulled the sharp edges of her despair, but it could not extinguish the profound, aching grief that now consumed her. She had found her son, but she had lost him forever. He was alive, yes, but he was lost to a world she could barely comprehend, a world of darkness and violence that had swallowed him whole. Her journey had led her to the truth, a truth more horrifying than any she had ever imagined, a truth that left her with no hope, only a terrible, agonizing acceptance. She was in a gilded cage, a prisoner of her own fierce love, condemned to watch her son live a life that was a betrayal of everything she had ever known. The steel door, now firmly closed, had severed Evelyn from the outside world, from the clamor of the subterranean factory, and, most agonizingly, from Liam. The sedative continued its insidious work, dulling the sharpness of her terror, yet leaving a profound, aching void in her heart. She was truly alone now, confined with the ghost of Michael, who sat unmoving and silent, a chilling testament to the price of survival in this brutal world. Days blurred into weeks, marked only by the arrival of the silent courier with bland food and the fresh, untasted dose of the sedative. Evelyn, consumed by a leaden lethargy, swallowed it each time, a grim ritual of compliance. The drug softened the edges of her reality, wrapping her in a hazy cocoon, but it couldn't fully numb the pain of her discovery. Liam was alive, but he was lost. She watched Michael, often for hours, a silent sentinel in the small, stark apartment. He rarely spoke, his eyes vacant, fixed on some unseen horror in his past. Sometimes he would trace patterns on the table with a finger, a repetitive, meaningless motion. Evelyn tried to reach him, to connect, to find some flicker of the Mick she remembered. She would whisper stories of their band, of their dreams, of the laughter they once shared. But he remained unresponsive, a living statue, his spirit long extinguished. His brokenness was a constant, agonizing reminder of the path Liam had chosen, the path that had led him to this gilded cage. Then, one evening, the steel door opened again. It was Liam. He stood framed in the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the harsh industrial lights of the cavern beyond. This time, however, he was not alone. The man from Arthur's photographs, the leader with the cold, intelligent eyes and the cultured voice, entered behind him. He carried an air of unspoken authority, his presence filling the small space with a palpable tension. Liam's face, usually an unreadable mask, held a flicker of something Evelyn couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of pride, perhaps, mixed with a chilling possessiveness. "Mother," he began, his voice flat, "you have adapted well. We believe you are ready." Ready for what? Evelyn thought, her drugged mind struggling to grasp the implication. The leader stepped forward, a faint, almost imperceptible smile gracing his lips. "Mrs. Reed, your son has spoken highly of your resilience, your ability to adjust. We understand this transition has been difficult, but you are now invaluable to us. Your public disappearance has been carefully managed. The authorities believe you have simply vanished, overwhelmed by the stress. The world is looking away." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing. "Your son, Liam, has risen to a position of great trust and influence within our organization. He has proven his loyalty, his acumen, and he has demonstrated a remarkable ability to acquire certain assets, talented individuals, like yourself. A cold dread settled in Evelyn's stomach. Acquire assets. Was that what she was? An asset. Liam finally spoke, his voice carrying a strange, almost manic undertone, a rare break in his usual stoicism. Mother, we are expanding, deepening our roots. We need people we can trust, people who can move unseen, who can operate without suspicion. Who better than you? The grieving mother, searching for answers. Who would ever suspect you are a crucial part of our operations? Evelyn stared at him, her mind struggling to pierce through the sedative-induced haze. He wanted her to work for them, to become a part of this criminal enterprise. The thought was abhorrent, a violation of everything she believed in. The leader continued, his voice smooth and persuasive. You will be invaluable. You will travel. You will make connections. You will facilitate certain transactions. All under the guise of your continuing search for the truth about the Obsidian Echoes. A perfect cover, wouldn't you agree? And in return, you will have comfort, security, and access to your son. A new life, Mrs. Reed, a very powerful life. He then gestured towards Michael, who still sat unresponsive. Your friend. He will be cared for. He will remain here, in peace. A quiet retirement. The implication was clear. Michael was useful only as a silent, broken reminder, a living symbol of what could happen if one didn't adapt. Evelyn felt a surge of raw, unadulterated fury, a brief, blinding flash of her former self, piercing through the sedated calm. She looked at Liam, her son who stood there, complicit, a stranger in every way that mattered. He was offering her a choice, but it was the pact with the devil. A life of gilded imprisonment, of complicity in unspeakable crimes, all for the sake of being near a son who no longer existed. Her gaze hardened, meeting Liam's cold eyes. For the first time in weeks, her voice was clear, strong, unwavering. No. Liam's expression flickered, a momentary surprise, quickly replaced by a chilling anger. The leader's placid smile vanished, his eyes narrowing. No, Mrs. Reed. His voice was cold, sharp as ice. That is not an option. It is my only option, Evelyn stated, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. I will not become a part of this. I will not become a monster like you, like him. Her gaze fixed on Liam, a silent accusation. You may have my body, but you will never have my soul. And I will never accept this. Never. Liam stepped forward, his hand clenching into a fist. Mother, do you understand what you are doing? You will die here, alone, and no one will ever know. Then let them not know, Evelyn replied, her gaze unwavering even as a profound sadness settled over her. I would rather die with my integrity intact than live a lie, serving a darkness that consumed my son. You chose this, Liam. I won't. The leader sighed, a slow, exasperated sound. He exchanged a look with Liam, a silent communication passing between them. Liam, his face a mask of cold fury, finally nodded, a barely perceptible gesture. The choice had been made. The leader turned back to Evelyn, his voice devoid of emotion. A regrettable decision, Mrs. Reed. You were given an opportunity, a final kindness from your son. Pity. Two large, silent figures emerged from the shadows behind Liam, their faces grim, their movements swift and decisive. They moved towards Evelyn, their hands outstretched. She did not resist. She closed her eyes, a faint smile touching her lips. She had found her truth. She had chosen her path. And in that final defiant act, she had reclaimed a piece of herself, a piece that even the darkest forces could not touch. The last thing Evelyn heard before the crushing darkness returned was the fading thrum of the machinery and the distant, almost imperceptible sound of an engine starting. A plane, taking off from the underground airfield, carrying its illicit cargo into the night. It was the sound of a world that continued to turn, even as her own reached its brutal, silent end. The mystery of the Obsidian Echoes would remain, their secrets buried deep, never to truly reach the light. And the mother who had dared to seek the truth would become another echo lost in the void, swallowed by the very darkness she had sought to expose.